USS Lexington. Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, along with his more well-known counterpart, Bill Gates, has become fairly well-known for another reason. In fact, Mr. Allen has played a key role in locating World War II shipwrecks and laying descendants of those who were aboard these vessels' minds at rest. In 2018, he explored the coast of Queensland in Australia, where he and his team discovered the remains of an icon of American combat, the USS Lexington, or Lady Lex. The warship hadn't been seen since 1942, when it took part in the Battle of the Coral Sea. This epic fight against the Japanese happened soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, with Australia forming the battleground when it became clear the enemy was advancing. A brutal chapter of the war, it helped contribute to the weakening of deadly Japanese firepower on the sea. Sadly, the Lexington didn't survive the onslaught. It was hit and went down with a crew of 216. A further 35 US aircraft also fell to the Japanese. The relatives of those on board have faced a long and painful wait for answers over the past 8 decades. Now, they finally have the location of where their loved ones ended up, a reported 800 kilometers from the coast of Queensland. The sighting of the Lexington's nameplate confirmed that the ship has indeed been found. It's incredible that it took so long, but it also gives you an idea of the enormous scale the war was fought on. Even in the 21st century, there are long-buried secrets waiting to be discovered so people can heal.
Air raid shelter. For years, Edinburgh resident Mia Gray and other tenants in her apartment building dismissed an old cupboard in the basement, filled with old paint cans and garbage, as storage space. Nobody gave it a second thought until a new neighbor, Liz Mowbray, moved in recently and expressed her curiosity. Gray and Mowbray teamed up to clean the space and discovered that it was far larger than anyone had noticed at first glance, and that it was filled with basins, a heater, and rotting wooden bunk beds dating back to the World War II era. The room served as an air raid shelter for the building's residents in the event of an attack before being forgotten about and rediscovered some 75 years later. There's a bench that runs all the way around the walls, no smoking signs, an emergency exit, an old stove, and 2 triple bunks, Gray told Edinburgh Live, adding that she believes there were more bunk beds, but that they were too damaged to identify and that the ceiling is reinforced with metal sheets. Gray believes that a previous tenant used the space for storage after the war and that the amount of junk they left there deterred anyone else from exploring it or repurposing it. Reporting for Edinburgh Live, Cian Traynor wrote that the city was not a major target during World War II, but that it still experienced its fair share of bombings, giving local residents ample reason to prepare for possible attacks. The Night Witches. One of the least known groups from World War II were the Night Witches. These were not real witches. Instead, they were female pilots who flew through the darkness of night in archaic plywood biplanes from the 1920s to go beyond German lines and rain down hellfire on the enemy. These women battled horrible harassment on the ground from their very own countrymen, treated skeptically and as if they didn't belong in the army. And yet by night, these ladies flew through the frost-bitten air to wreak havoc on the Germans, who feared the Night Witches so completely that when a single German airman managed to shoot one of them down, he was awarded with an Iron Cross medal. The Night Witches were part of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and they dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on the evil Nazis. The reason they used biplanes instead of modern planes is that they could easily sweep into enemy territory without being spotted by modern tech. They were too small to show up on standard radar and couldn't be seen on infrared locators. They didn't use radios and couldn't be tracked that way either. They were basically ghosts. But here's the deal. You might have thought the Night Witches were American or maybe even British, but they were actually Soviet. The squadron itself was the idea of Marina Raskova, known by historians as the Soviet Amelia Earhart. She was the first female navigator in the Soviet Air Force. She also had an extensive record of long-distance flights. In the end, the Night Witches proved a vital part of the Soviets pushing back the Germans and making it to Berlin. Their last flight was May 4, 1945, just 3 days before Germany surrendered.
HMS Urge. In 1942, a U-class submarine from Britain was hit while traveling en route to Alexandria in Egypt. This was wartime, and tragically, such things happen. But the thing is, no one quite knew what happened to the sub, which was known as the HMS Urge. The truth finally came to light, with news reported in 2019 that the remains of the vessel and no less than 44 crew members had been located near the coast of Malta. Lying around 400 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, HMS Urge was also notable for having been found in good condition. Thankfully, investigators had discovered the wreck first before anyone else could interfere with the site. What brought down the sub? It's believed a mine was behind the tragedy. The HMS Urge is by no means alone when it comes to having spent a long period lost at sea. Reports state that 13 such submarines never returned from active duty, leaving unanswered questions and anxious families. Many of these vessels have been found, but this often occurs decades later, adding to the pain.
Enigma machine. While searching for discarded fishing nets in the Baltic Sea near the Danish border last year, a team of German divers discovered a rare Enigma cipher machine that the Nazi military used during World War II to send and receive secret messages. At first, the divers thought they had found a typewriter, but underwater archaeologist Florian Huber quickly identified it as historically significant. "I've made many exciting and strange discoveries in the past 20 years, Huber told Reuters, but I never dreamt that we would one day find one of the legendary Enigma machines. Crews from 50 submarines or U-boats received an order to scuttle their vessels and destroy encryption devices in Gelting Bay shortly before Germany surrendered in May 1945. Huber's team suspects that the Enigma was one of the devices that went overboard in an effort to avoid having the machines land in Allied hands. Over 200 German submarines were sunk in the North and Baltic Seas at the war's end. Several 100,000 Enigma machines were produced, but only hundreds are known to exist, and they fetch tens of thousands of euros each at auction. The recently discovered device was given to the Archaeology Museum in Schleswig, Germany. During the war, one of the major turning points was when a team of British cryptographers led by Alan Turing cracked the Enigma code, suddenly allowing them to read all the German communication. The downed pilot. A young boy in Denmark was researching the topic of World War II for his history class when he accidentally discovered the wreckage of a fighter plane in a field near his house, complete with the ghoulish remains of the pilot in the cockpit. The bizarre story behind this pilot's death is amazing. According to CNN, the Danish boy went out with his father and a metal detector to look for relics from the war. The boy's father was hopeful they would find some plates or something interesting for him to show at school. But then they began to find pieces of plane debris. They actually borrowed an excavator from the neighbor and dug until they found the full aircraft, which the father believed must have crashed in November or December of 1944, based on an old story his grandfather had told him. The curator of the Historical Museum of Northern Jutland was given the possessions found on the pilot, along with other relevant clues to confirm the man's identity and find out his story. It's now believed that the pilot came from a German training base, though it's not clear how he crashed. In his pockets, the Danish boy found his wallet, a few scraps of ID papers, and 3 unused condoms. It's not clear what exactly this guy thought he was going to do with those by himself up in his airplane, but he crashed before he could ever use them.
The Virginia. This was an oil tanker that was sunk by German torpedoes during World War II. At the time, the tanker was stationary at the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. Sadly, 27 crew members died in the 1942 attack. Years later, in 2001, the wreck of the Virginia was found again. However, it wasn't archaeologists looking for clues who discovered the tanker, but an exploration team working for the energy industry. Their sonar uncovered the Virginia, which led to the inevitable question: what were they gonna do with it? In an interesting move, it was decided to keep the ship where it was and use it as a helpful tool to study the movement of the seafloor. How does that work? Well, the Gulf is an important area for energy companies, who have pipelines there along with other infrastructure. Seafloor studies are useful in attempting new solutions to potential disasters caused by ruptured or damaged pipelines caused by nature's interference. By observing how the Virginia reacts to such events, the team can get a better idea of what seafloor behavior is going on down there. The Virginia reportedly sits in 200 meters of water, meaning it is truly part of the ecosystem. It may be an unusual move for sure, and the tragedy of losing the crew is still foremost in a lot of people's minds. However, it's fascinating to hear that a World War II wreck, and an oil tanker no less, can play a role in studying a natural environment. Enigma. From broken down shipwrecks to broken code machines, Enigma machines associated with World War II, the machines designed and used by the Nazis to encode their messages, were mostly destroyed during the tail end of the fighting and are an extremely rare find. The last place you may expect to find one is underwater, but that's precisely what happened in the Baltic Sea in late 2020. and the crew scanning the seabed were actually from the Worldwide Fund for Nature. They sought to clear away old and obstructive fishing nets and got more than they bargained for with this rusty chunk of military history. How did an Enigma machine wind up in the sea? Well, thanks to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the messages detailing how it occurred were revealed. In 1945, Germany was facing defeat, so it made sense to trash their kit and prevent the Allies from finding out any more secrets. Enigma machines on subs appear to have gone down with the ship, part of a tactic known as scuttling. The theory is that this machine was released into the water in 1945. As reports state, the machine is in far from showroom condition. That said, the Enigmas were ordered to be destroyed, so any traces that remain of these dramatic times are welcome. It took many decades, but perhaps this little machine's story can finally be told. Major submarine find. The fight against Hitler in World War II involved using everything at the American military's disposal to help defeat the oncoming threat. One of the subs put into action dated back to 1918 and was called the R-12. It was the oldest sub used during the war, but there wasn't an expectation that this could go out there and engage in combat with the enemy. But it functioned perfectly well as a trading craft. That was until a tragedy happened in 1943. While out in the Florida Keys on a practice run, it took on water and quickly sank. And it may have remained hidden from public eyes indefinitely were it not for explorer Tim Taylor and his partner Christine Dennison. They went out and located the R-12, which was approximately 600 feet down. It was then a question of informing the families, some of whom traveled out to pay tribute by scattering flowers in the water. This sense of closure is reportedly what motivates Taylor and his team, and they haven't just traced one sub. Up to the present day, they have found 5 sunken subs from World War II alone. The story of the R-12 is a reminder that not all of these vessels went down as a result of being in conflict. Everyone put their lives at risk, from soldiers and sailors on the front line to those who trained them.
Wrecked submarine. The American Navy submarine USS Grenadier sank in the Straits of Malacca in 1943 when it was attacked by a Japanese aircraft. A torpedo struck as the vessel closed in on 2 Japanese cargo ships between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, and after failing to repair the sub, the crew deliberately scuttled it. The Japanese ships took the Grenadier's 76 crew members as prisoners of war, and the sunken submarine's location was subsequently lost. Divers located the wreck last year 280 feet, 85 meters below the water's surface, and subsequently identified it as the Grenadier by cross-referencing military records and diving to the bottom of the ocean. Because of the vessel's depth, the team had to use a special mix of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium to breathe, and they could only stay at the site for a few minutes at a time according to Live Science. It took 5 dives for the divers to be able to stay with a fair amount of certainty that the submarine matches the measurements and description of the Grenadier. The next step is for the U.S. Navy to officially confirm the find. 4 of the crew members who were taken captive by the Japanese died in enemy custody, but the rest survived in Japanese prison camps until the end of the war. The team that found the Grenadier hopes to continue searching for 2 British World War II submarines that are believed to be in the general area, the HMS Stonehenge and the HMS Porpoise. Secret military base. In 1942, the year after Hitler invaded Russia, the Nazis built a top-secret military base high in the Arctic on Alexandra Land, an island located roughly 650 miles north of the Russian coast in the Barents Sea. Dubbed Schatzgrabe, or treasure hunter, the base served as one of a network of tactical weather watching stations for the Germans. A team of scientists from the Russian Arctic National Park announced the discovery of the base in 2016. They were the first to thoroughly investigate the site and collected over 600 items for further study, including canisters of food and other supplies that were airdropped from German planes, weapons and ammunition, batteries, emergency flares, and other military equipment that was left behind when the base closed in 1944. The site is in ruins today, but also contains remnants of tents, bunkers, fuel drums, and an airstrip. Although it functioned as a weather base, Schatzgrabe was heavily fortified in case of an attack. The base was abandoned when staff members became poisoned from eating contaminated polar bear meat and were evacuated from the site by the German military. Murdered Catholic nuns. When the Nazis withdrew from Poland toward the end of World War II in 1944, the Red Army invaded the country and attempted to seize control by looting and destroying churches and subduing militias. Historical records show that the following year, Soviet soldiers murdered even Catholic nuns from the Order of St. Catherine of Alexandria who worked as nurses at a hospital. Archaeologists found and identified the slain nun skeletons in 2020 as part of an ongoing project by Poland's Institute of National Remembrance. They also unearthed crucifixes, rosaries, medallions, and religious clothing around the remains, according to Live Science. To reach the 3 most recently discovered bodies, archaeologists relied on local archival records to locate them within a municipal cemetery and first exhumed newer burials that were on top of them. Records show that one nun, Sister Generosa, was locked in the hospital's attic before her death, while another, Sister Christofora, was stabbed with a bayonet 16 times after a long fight with a Soviet soldier, having her eyes and tongue gouged out in the process. The Red Army reportedly beat patients and attacked nuns who tried to intervene, causing horrific injuries and death. Pearl Harbor. The Empire of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, just shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning. People today don't really have a full idea of what happened. Yes, it was a brutal surprise attack from Japan, but it didn't actually come out of nowhere. Japan and the United States were already having serious differences. Japan declared war on China in 1937 and continuously pushed into Chinese territory, committing massacres and other horrible atrocities. The Americans were not happy about this, and so they smacked Japan with economic sanctions and trade embargoes. They thought that without access to money and oil, Japan would behave nicely. This sour relationship went on for quite some time. There were negotiations between Tokyo and Washington, but nothing ever worked out. War was really inevitable by the time Pearl Harbor happened. The only real surprise is that nobody had anticipated an attack so close to the North American continent. The Americans thought that if Japan were to attack, it would be somewhere closer to them, like a European colony in the South Pacific, maybe Singapore or Indochina. When the planes came crashing down in Pearl Harbor, it was a huge surprise. Over 2,400 United States citizens died, 20 naval vessels were destroyed or heavily damaged, and 300 planes were taken out. But as most of us know, this was a grave error for Japan. Their goal was to wipe out the entire Pacific Fleet so that the US couldn't fight back as Japan continued their rampage. But of course, they did fight back, and they won. Without a tail fin. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced airplane, or at least one of them during World War II. It had guns that could fire via remote control, it was the heaviest production plane in the world and had a massive range, along with huge bomb loads and massive defense capabilities. It utilized the high speed of a Boeing 117 while having increased lift. They were used heavily in the war in the Pacific, with at least 1,000 of them bombing Tokyo throughout the war. It was a B-29 called the Enola Gay that actually dropped the first atomic bomb ever on Hiroshima, followed by a second B-29 3 days later dropping the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. But there was one B-29 Superfortress that proved more capable than the others. It was nicknamed the Rover Boys Express, and its mission was to destroy Tokyo. The plane was part of a larger force who met serious resistance as they flew over Mount Fuji. While being shot, the B-29 lost its tail fin. The whole squadron was overwhelmed and gunned down in the air. But even without its tail fin, the B-29 kept fighting to the last second. It made a messy crash landing into a village, killing 7 civilians. 7 crew members managed to bail out, were captured by the Japanese, with only 5 surviving to the end of the war as prisoners, eventually liberated and set free. Hitler fooled by a homeless man. A dead homeless man named Glinder Michael became a war hero in January of 1943 after he was found dead in the city of London from eating rat poison. At his time of death, he was 34 years old and destitute. Also, there was a scheme to trick the Nazis into thinking that the Allies were about to attack Greece instead of Sicily. But they needed a body to trick Hitler. So they took this homeless guy and made him a part of what would be codenamed Operation Mincemeat. He was transformed into Major William Martin. He was given a death notice in a newspaper with forged documents and love letters. He was dressed up like a Royal Marine. Then his corpse was thrown into the water where it would ultimately be found and then handed over to the Spanish authorities. But why was it so important for the Spanish to find the homeless guy's body? Because the British had given him some very fake documents outlining an invasion of Sardinia in Greece. A fisherman dragged the homeless guy's body from the ocean. The papers were found on his body and turned over to the Nazi command, and eventually they made it to Hitler's desk. Hitler then ordered a huge bulk of defenses to be diverted to Greece, taking much-needed troops from Russia. But instead of attacking Greece, the Allied forces landed in Sicily and won the day without heavy casualties. The homeless man, or at least his body, was a hero.
Fallen soldiers. In 1944, a B-24 Liberator bomber was headed back to base in Italy following a confrontation with German flyers. They'd gone out to target oil refineries and strike a blow against the Nazis. However, the Germans had badly damaged the plane. It was sadly the end of the line for this bomber, named the Tulsa American, and its 10 crew members. 7 survived, but 3 went missing after the craft hit the waters of the Adriatic by the Croatian coast. Not only was this a tragedy for the families of the men who were lost, it was also the final moments of a piece of aviation history. You see, the Tulsa American was the last Liberator to roll off the production line over in Oklahoma, so it became doubly significant when the wreck of the Tulsa American was found in 2010. Uncovering the B-24 and its lost crew members has been compared by some to the story of Amelia Earhart. While that case remains unresolved, this provides at least some comfort to the families of the fallen. It took years for details to come to light, but human remains were located, together with remnants of the plane, such as life preservers and other details. What happened on impact is that the nose and cockpit peeled away, which sounds really dramatic. The B-24 then sank to a depth of over 130 feet. As we've seen from other entries on this rundown, it can be decades before the wrecks are discovered and brought to light again. Once the Tulsa American was found, there was a long wait while the remains were studied and identified. One of the deceased crew members, pilot Eugene Ford, was taken to Arlington National Cemetery in 2018. Ford's son fought in Vietnam and is also laid to rest there.
The last missing German warship. In April 1940, German forces invaded Norway through the port city of Kristiansand, destroying its maritime defenses in a matter of hours and forcing the country's king and government to flee to Britain. To aid in their conquest, the Nazis used a repurposed ship that was built in the 1920s called the Karlsruhe. Shortly after starting its return voyage, the 571-foot-long, 174-meter swastika-bearing vessel was hit by a British submarine torpedo. Its crew evacuated, and the Germans deliberately sunk the ship 15 miles, 24 kilometers off the Norwegian coast, where it came to rest 1,607 feet, 490 meters below the water's surface. The Karlsruhe is recorded in historical accounts, but for around 80 years, according to Norwegian Maritime Museum archaeologist and researcher Frode Kavola, nobody knew exactly where it went down. That is, until last year, when the Norwegian power grid operator Statnett identified the wreck in images and sonar scans dating back to 2017 with the help of a maritime archaeologist. The sunken vessel sits just 50 feet, 15 meters from a subsea power cable that Statnett has been operating since 1977 and was discovered during a routine inspection. In a detailed report of the discovery, the Indian Express reported that the Karlsruhe was the last missing big German World War II-era ship. It may contain thousands of liters of oil and other materials, which experts reportedly say could lead to an ecological disaster in the event of an attempted salvage. And while records show that most of the Karlsruhe crew were evacuated, it's unknown whether the site will be classified as an underwater war grave. The survivor. Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived being hit by 2 atomic bombs. He was preparing to leave the city of Hiroshima when the first bomb hit. Of course, he wasn't in the instant kill zone, but he was close enough to feel the shockwave, which apparently spun him through the air like a tornado and sent him hurtling into a patch of potatoes. He was about 2 miles from ground zero. After Yamaguchi woke up, he could see the falling ash and the cloud of fire rising over the city. His face and arms were burned and his eardrums were ruptured. But he had business to attend to. He boarded a train and went on an overnight ride to his hometown, Nagasaki. This is where his wife and his child lived. Even after being struck by an atomic bomb, this guy went to work 3 days later. He tried to explain to his boss that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a bomb, and his boss didn't believe him. Just as Yamaguchi was being called a liar, the second bomb dropped so close that the office windows were shattered and a mushroom cloud exploded into the city. Somehow, this guy survived being within close proximity to both nukes. His hair fell out, he became gangrenous, he vomited endlessly, and he was horribly sickened from the radiation. Nonetheless, he actually healed and went on to live a perfectly normal life and died in 2009 at the age of 93.
SS Thistlegorm. This British vessel was used by the Merchant Navy and was sunk in the Red Sea in 1941 after a bomber attack. It had only been in the water for a year, having been constructed in Sunderland, England. She went to Glasgow and then set out to Alexandria, Egypt to play her part in the war effort. The SS Thistlegorm was supposed to reach Alexandria via the Suez Canal. However, this was blocked due to an accident. The Thistlegorm dropped anchor nearby, but unfortunately, it wouldn't proceed any further. It was during this time that it was hit and went down. Located at the Sinai Peninsula's southern tip, the ship went on to become one of the most explored World War II wrecks on record. The site is accessible for trained divers, owing to its exposed nature. Those who ventured down can see something of a treasure trove because the Thistlegorm's cargo is still there and in great condition considering what happened. Unlike others on our list, the Thistlegorm didn't have to wait too long before being found post-war. The world-famous marine explorer Jacques Cousteau went to the Red Sea in the early 1950s. He relied on local fishermen to pinpoint the wreck before bringing some of its contents to the surface. Unfortunately, this was a brief taste of fame for the vessel, which got people's attention again once diving increased in the area around the 1990s. With a resort in place, the SS Thistlegorm turned into a tourist attraction. Despite the fun, it's important to remember the role it played in the conflict and its status as a historical relic.
Missing airmen's remains. When 23-year-old U.S. Army Air Corps Force pilot Alfred Turgeon's plane was shot down during the Operation Tidal Wave bombing mission of Romania's oil fields and refineries in 1943, only the captain survived. The unidentified remains of the crew and other soldiers lost in the attack were buried as unknown soldiers in a section of the Romanian cemetery dedicated to the fallen military members. Because around 100 soldiers were taken captive during the mission, Turgeon's family held out hope that he was still alive, perhaps as a prisoner of war or suffering from amnesia, according to the man's nephew David Bass, who spoke with Anchorage Daily News. But they never found him. In 2017, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, set out to identify the remains of soldiers exhumed from the cemetery who were believed to have died in Operation Tidal Wave. Using dental and anthropological analysis and advanced familial DNA testing, scientists identified one of the individuals as Turgeon, who was one of 5 Alaskans whose remains were not recovered after the war. The process of recovering and returning Turgeon's remains gave his descendants an opportunity to learn about the relative they had never met, who died serving their country, and gave his one surviving sister the chance to pay proper respects to the sibling she lost nearly 80 years earlier. Turgeon was buried with full military honors in Washington state, where he was laid to rest next to his older sister. Tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers who went missing during World War II remained unaccounted for after the conflict ended, and to this day the American government remains determined to recover as many of these fallen fighters as possible. The identification of Turgeon's remains is just one example of how advancing technology is finally giving surviving relatives long-sought closure and filling in the gaps in family histories for younger generations. The bagpipes. In 1915, 18-year-old Michael McDougall left Halifax, Canada, and spent 4 years fighting in World War I. He had duties as a soldier, but he also had the responsibility of playing the bagpipes to lift the spirits of his fellow armymen. He was a soldier in the 25th Battalion Nova Scotian Rifles and completed his service and returned home, bringing his bagpipes with him. But he never really told his family what the bagpipes were used for. He would sometimes take them out, go into the garage, make some music, then come back inside and return the bagpipes to their special box without saying a word to his family. His granddaughter described him to Global News as being a quiet man. It wasn't until the soldier died in 1969 that the bagpipes began to move around. They went to his eldest son, who learned to play them. Then, after his eldest son died, they landed in the hands of somebody else in the family who lived thousands of miles away. His granddaughter, now a woman of her own, was visiting a war memorial when she saw another set of bagpipes on display. She remembered the ones her grandfather used to play and wanted to get them back so that she could put them into a museum as well, where they could stay forever. What followed was a lengthy battle that lasted for nearly 2 years as the granddaughter tried to wrestle the family bagpipes from another, more distant member of the family all the way across the country. But she finally got them back, and over 100 years after her grandfather blew them in Europe, they were gifted to the local museum as an important piece of Canadian military heritage. Sunken bones. The wreckage of the Tulsa American, a B-224 Liberator bomber built in Oklahoma and the very last of its kind, was just discovered sitting at the bottom of the Adriatic Sea in pieces near the Croatian island of Vis. It was found split into 2 main sections, with the nose of the plane being found peeled open like a banana. According to the Smithsonian, the wreckage has painted an amazing story of the fate that befell those who had piloted it during the final years of World War II. It was in December of 1944 when the aircraft was badly damaged during a battle with the German Air Force in occupied Poland. The crew of the aircraft tried to make an emergency landing but failed and crashed off the coast of what is today Croatia. 7 of the airmen were saved by brave local fishermen. 3 were lost. Amazingly, archaeologists working at the crash site found military equipment, articles of clothing, and even a boot. Even more incredible is that human bones were found scattered amongst the wreckage. They haven't been tested yet, but experts are pretty certain that they belong to the 3 missing soldiers who went down with the aircraft. The remains are currently pending DNA analysis. If any matches are established, the remains are to be given a proper burial.
F4U Corsair. Our final entry is a World War II era plane, yet one that met a watery fate 3 years after the war ended. While it may have initially survived the conflict, it did meet its end not long after. This Corsair aircraft was flying in the vicinity of the Hawaiian island of Oahu in 1948 when it finally gave up the ghost. The engine reportedly failed and the pilot had to make an emergency landing on the water's surface. Thankfully, the pilot was okay and managed to make it out and back to land. As for the plane, it wasn't so lucky and sank approximately 115 feet below the surface. There, it became part of the ecosystem. Those who dive to view it will probably notice the community of eels that call the spot home. A visit to the Corsair aircraft comes with a hefty note of caution. This is a trip for experienced divers only. Mention has been made of the treacherous conditions in that stretch of water, which can take unsuspecting folk by surprise. You're also advised to be in the company of a guide. Whether they are perfectly preserved ships or the warped remains of a proud fleet, underwater shipwrecks capture a moment in time. The effort needed to find and explore these sites is rewarded by a glimpse into a very different time. These wartime examples are especially evocative.
Hidden Hatch. A secret room in a building in Kent, England led to uncovering secrets from the past. While it's now part of an independent girls' boarding school called the Benedin School, during World War II, the site served as a military hospital. But it's easy to forget the history of your surroundings until you stumble upon something from a seemingly long-forgotten past. During a study session in their recently remodeled boarding house earlier this month, 4 10th grade students spotted a hidden hatch on the wall, concealed by a wardrobe. The curious pupils moved the wardrobe out of the way and opened the mysterious door, which led to a small section of the building's eaves. They crawled into the space to further explore and found a collection of artifacts dating back to the 1940s, including candy wrappers and letters. In addition, the girls collected a Lux soap packet, a cigarette wrapper, and matches. Fragments of 2 letters discovered in the hatch, which were likely written by staff members stationed at the hospital, are the most telling among the items. One dating back to 1941 was written by a woman named Betty to her sweetheart, Bobby. It includes details on how his family members were doing and updates about her life, including a recent theater visit. Speaking with Kent Online, Haley McNally said, "It's really cool because we're living in the modern day, but you hear stories of what happened in the war, and this really brought it to life." Pretty cool, especially considering not everyone will be lucky enough to stumble upon a hidden time capsule from 80 years ago. The Real Private Ryan. The true story behind Saving Private Ryan is far more fascinating than what was depicted in the movie starring Tom Hanks. The movie was based on the real-life story of 4 brothers who joined the war and went to liberate Europe from Germany. Edward was the first brother to go, shot down somewhere over Burma and presumed to be dead. Then on June 6, 1944, brothers Robert and Fritz began in the assault. Robert was stationed outside the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, where he held off an onslaught of Germans with the help of 2 other soldiers to cover the rest of his platoon's escape. He was gunned down in action. At the same time, Preston was on the shores of Utah Beach. He died with the rest of his platoon trying to destroy a German battery. At this point, by June 7th, 3 of the brothers are believed dead. Somehow, the War Department learned of the 3 brothers dying and that there was still one left. They decided to dispatch Fritz, the only remaining son, back to the United States. This job fell to Father Francis Sampson, the regimental chaplain. He finally got hold of Fritz and sent him back home. Then the next year in May of 1945, it turned out Edward was still alive. He'd bailed from his plane during the crash and been caught by the Japanese, then eventually freed. He returned to New York and the 2 brothers were reunited. About 55 years later, Steven Spielberg turned their story into a movie. Propaganda and carrots. During World War II, propaganda and carrots went hand in hand. First of all, the truth is that carrots have a large amount of vitamin A, and vitamin A really helps the health of a person's eye. There was a 1998 Johns Hopkins study that even found supplemental pills could help those with vitamin A deficiency to have better vision. However, carrots are just a small piece of the puzzle and can't actually give you superhuman vision any more than eating too many blueberries can turn you blue. Carrots cannot help you see in the dark. But somewhere along the line, the myth was born and it's still around today. How did everyone come to believe that carrots improve eyesight? It probably came because of British propaganda starting in the 1940s. At the time, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was attacking during the night when it was darkest. The British government at the time issued blackouts throughout the city to make it more difficult for them to hit their targets. At the same time, the British had developed a very new and very secret radar technology that could pinpoint an incoming enemy before they reached the English Channel. But to keep this information out of the hands of the Nazis, the UK ministry instead blamed the success of their pilots defending the English Channel in the dark of night on a stable diet of carrots. According to historical records, they then started a campaign of propaganda connecting night sight with eating carrots, leafy greens, and yellow vegetables. This was a tactic to confuse the Germans and make them think the British were excellent pilots at night, all because they ate a lot of carrots. What's your favorite legendary war story? Tell me about it in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and check out more amazing videos from the channel.